For the title. We're busy with a series on arising, as you can see on the wall. My title this morning is Arise the Disqualified. Now, maybe it was different in your day, but when I was back at school, during either break time or phys ed PT class, that often, we would often just play soccer or rugby or whatever. And the way it worked is that the two strongest sportsmen were immediately the two captains, and they stood on one side, and then the rest of us lined up, and they would each call a name, and you'd go into the different teams and so on. And so it would start off, obviously, the captains are going to choose the strongest other players, and the line would get shorter and shorter, and then they'd choose their friends, etc. And then, when the line comes to 4 or 5 people, that's when it became embarrassing and became brutal, because you know that they knew. And you know that the ones left in the line, these are the kids that were better built for chess and for the choir than for the sports team. And so, and they knew that they were unwanted. They didn't match up. In fact, they would weaken your team. So what often happened is that you'd pick, and then eventually there's one last guy and it's your turn, and you actually say to the other team, you can have him as well. What for Frankie ook. Because they just didn't qualify. See, in South Africa, we live in a wonderful country, but we understand what it means for people to be overlooked. We should by now, in any event. To be disqualified for some reason or other, to be told that you don't come from the right place, you don't have the right background. You're not the obvious choice, really. Siya Kolisi grew up in the Eastern Cape. He grew up inside of PE, Gqeberha, in a township on the outskirts called Zwide. far, far away from the normal, traditional pathways of rugby greatness. By many, many standards, he was never expected to be even a candidate to wear the green and gold. Much less to actually lead the Springboks. But he arose. He became our first black Springbok captain. And in 2019, he stood on the world stage and he lifted the Rugby World Cup as millions around this globe watched. And in 2023, the same Siya Kolisi lifted this William Webb Ellis Trophy again as only the second captain in the history of rugby to win head-to-head, in fact, to win the Rugby World Cup twice and to win it head-to-head. Not just as a player, but as a captain. And beyond as a captain, as a symbol of what is possible for the seemingly disqualified. Sometimes we may feel overlooked because of where we come from, our background, our race, our status, our gender, our physique. But when it comes to the most interesting portion I've ever preached from, Matthew chapter 1, we find some really interesting surprises. We find people who were not overlooked despite being disqualified. People that should never have made it. And yet, they are there. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 to 6. One of the most boring portions in all of the Bible. Here goes. See if you can find the gems as we go. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. The son of David, the son of Abram. Abram was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Abinadab. Abinadab, the father of Nashon. Nashon, the father of Basson. No, Nashon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of King David. David, the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. I'm not too sure whether you noticed and picked up on the 4 names that I try to highlight as we go. Interestingly, I stopped at verse 6. If you read the rest of the genealogy of Jesus, you'll find that there are 4 ladies mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. Very seldom are there any ladies mentioned in any genealogy. It's as if the men did this all by themselves. Wonderful in the good old days. Any event, in these first 6 verses, 4 ladies are mentioned. 4 names, 4 ladies in the entire genealogy of Jesus. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the one they don't even mention by name, they simply refer to her as Uriah's wife, being Bathsheba. Now, if you and I were to write the genealogy of Jesus, if we had to write down or create the family tree of the Messiah, we'd do a proper job. We'd choose the best people, the purest, the noblest, the most qualified. But somehow, Jesus, or God, tends to just do the opposite. He deliberately chose to include people that shouldn't be included. By human standards, by our standards, they should never have been there. They should have been disqualified. So come with me and let's have a closer look at these 4 women. The 4 women that made it into the genealogy of Jesus. The 4 women that should never have been there, that should never have been mentioned. The 4 women that should have been disqualified. Tamar, the forgotten and wronged. Tamar, the least known of the 4, I would assume. What do you know about Tamar? Now, as I said, Tamar is most probably the least known of these 4 ladies. We find her story in one chapter, Genesis chapter 38. Right in the middle of the story, the whole chronicle of Joseph. There's this one chapter, really out of place. They could have skipped the entire story of Tamar, but they didn't. Genesis 38 tells us all about Tamar. So I'm going to briefly share her story. The story of Tamar goes as follows, that it involves Judah, the son of Jacob, as we've seen earlier. Judah, the father of the tribe of Judah. It always sounds so, the tribe of Jesus, the tribe of Judah. So let's look at good old Judah. It says, Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now, the story goes as follows. She, Tamar, was actually married to Judah's son, not to Judah. His son died, and as tradition would have it, she was passed on because they did not have any children. She was passed on to the next son. Sadly, he also died. And by that time, the youngest son was not yet old enough to get married. And so she was promised to the third son, but she had to wait for him to grow up. But Judah delayed his promise out of fear that the third son would also die. Yeah. Bit of Tamara de Melker. Okay. So, don't go there. Focus. Genesis 38. Genesis 38. Verse 12 to 16 says, after a long time, Judah's wife, not Tamar, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men that were shearing his sheep. And his friend Hirah the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and sat down at the entrance of the city, which is on the road from Timnah. For she saw that Shelah, or probably Shelah, Shelah sounds a bit feminine, Shelah, the third brother, had now grown up, but she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her on the roadside and said to her, "Come now, let me sleep with you." This is Judah, father of the tribe of Judah, which he does. She falls pregnant. A couple of months later, Judah is told, the grapevine comes to Judah, and he is told that your daughter-in-law is pregnant. This unmarried widow is pregnant through prostitution, and he demands, "Bring her out, let her be burnt." She was slightly cleverer than he thought, and she could prove that he, in fact, was the father himself. And so she gives birth to twins, and she becomes part of the family tree of Jesus. So Tamar, a widow, denied justice according to the custom of the day, took matters into her own hands. Complicated, dramatic, drastic, causing a scandal, absolutely broken, messy circumstances. Yet God, but God, includes her. And this is the punchline for her story, because God is not intimidated by complicated circumstances. See, God is not intimidated by complicated stories. So the story from Tamar, as we said, arise, the disqualified, is arise, your past, your messy decisions does not cancel God's purposes. Let's move on to the second one, Rahab. Rahab, a sinful outsider. Smile, Pam, it's going to get better. Rahab, much better known than Tamar, especially in any event amongst the men of the city of Jericho. Because whenever we read of dear Rahab, she's referred to as Rahab the prostitute. So in Joshua chapter 2, verse 1, we find her, and it says, "Then Joshua the son of Nun," interesting that Nun would have a son, in any event, Joshua the son of Nun secretly sent spies to Shittim. "Go look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So they went and they entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Now you probably know the rest of the story, how she hid the spies from the men of Jericho that was looking for them, how later she helped them to escape through the city wall. Her house was built into the city wall, and there was this red scarlet rope that they used to escape. And there was this promise made that if she let this rope hang out of the window, then when they take the city, she and her household would be spared. She and everyone inside of the house would be spared. So Joshua chapter 6 verse 17 reads, "The city and all that was in it are devoted to the Lord," which means it was all going to be killed. "Only Rahab the prostitute and all who were with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies that we sent." So Rahab, unlike Tamar, was indeed a prostitute. She was a pagan, and she was from a doomed city. Rahab was disqualified. But God responded to her faith. In fact, Rahab is even mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. You find Rahab in the great chapter of faith, although she's still referred to in Hebrews chapter 11 as Rahab the prostitute. God, this is the takeaway from Rahab, God does not consult your past before writing your future. God does not consult your past before writing your future. So arise, the disqualified. Arise, your sin does not disqualify you when you turn to God in faith. Arise, your sin does not disqualify you when you turn to God in faith. Third one is Ruth. Ruth, the foreign outsider. Now, by all standards, Ruth is the good girl in the story. If we had a lineup of the four ladies this morning, you would have chosen Ruth as your head girl. Absolutely. But let's just dig it a little deeper into the background of Ruth. Do you remember Lot, the nephew of Abram? Remember that how he chose the well-watered side, and then eventually it said that he settled in that area, and eventually it said, and he moved closer, he pitched his tents closer to Sodom, and eventually it says, in the neighborhood of Sodom, and then it says, when the angel of God arrived, he was sitting at the gate as one of the elders of Sodom. In any event, let's move on. So after the destruction of Sodom, we read the following. Lot and his two daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his two daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, our father is old, and there is no man here around whom we could lie with, as is the custom of people all over the world. Now the noble plan. Let's get our father to drink wine and then lie with him and preserve our family line through our father. The result. In Genesis 19, verse 37, it says, the older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. Ruth, the Moabite. So, dear Ruth, head girl Ruth, didn't come from just another nation. She came from a people with a painful, complicated, incestuous past. And furthermore, secondly, about Ruth, the Moabites refused to help the Israelites when they moved towards the promised land from Egypt. In fact, their king, Balak, rented a guy named Balaam. Remember him, the guy with the talking donkey? Almost like Shrek, just the biblical one. So Balak rented Balaam to come and curse the Israelites. This is the Moabites. But the worst is that the Moabite woman led Israel into idolatry and immorality. It says that while Israel was staying in Shittim, obviously a bad neighborhood, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite woman. The men began to indulge in sexual immorality with the Moabite woman who lived in the area. They invited them to sacrifice to their gods. The people ate and bowed down before these gods. So Israel joined in worship of Baal Peor, and the Lord's anger burnt against them. Because of this, God gave a strong command. No Ammonite or Moabite. By the way, the older sister of Lot had a son, Moab, the father of the Moabites. The younger sister pulled the same stunt the next night. She had a son, Ammon, the father of the Ammonites. So, hence, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. So this meant that the Moabites were formally excluded from worshiping God. They were seen and were declared by God as spiritually unclean outsiders. So then when we retrace the story or relook at the story of Ruth, when she enters the story, she enters as a foreigner, firstly, with a bad passport. a history of political hostility towards Israel, spiritually excluded in status, and herself as a widow, socially vulnerable in the community. She is completely disqualified. But then, Ruth, the individual, the young lady who had lost her husband, makes a choice, and she says to Naomi, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die and be buried." So Ruth's choice ends up in her becoming the great-grandmother of King David, showing something quite profound, that God's grace can override what law and history and culture forbid. Now, if Ruth can arise from her past, her lineage as a Moabite, then no background, no history, no label has the final say over your life. If Ruth can overcome all of this, her background, the history, the labels, etc., then you can overcome whatever it is, whatever cards were dealt to you. So the bottom line is, arise. Your background does not limit your future in God's kingdom. Arise. Your background does not override your future in God's kingdom. And then Bathsheba, the shamed bathrobe model. So just like Delilah, Bathsheba does not need much of an introduction. Suffice to say that both Delilah and Bathsheba were able to make hard men stumble. Just listen to this disaster, how a disaster can develop and unfold in three simple verses. So in 2 Samuel 11, verse 2 to 4, verse 1 is quite comical to me. I excluded it, but I'm going to pop it in. Verse 1 simply says, "In the time of spring, when kings go off to war." It's like in the summertime, when the English play cricket. In the springtime, when kings go off to war, David stayed at home. Okay, from verse 2. One night, David couldn't get to sleep, and he went for a stroll on the roof palace, and he looked over the city. And he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking an evening bath. And he sent to find out who she was. And he was told that she's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah. Then David sent for her, and when she came, he slept with her. Suddenly, insomnia was away. He slept with her, and then she returned home. Okay, I'm quite sure we all know the rest of the story. Her pregnancy, David's deceit, how he set this thing up with the general Joab to put Uriah at the front of the battle, the death of Uriah, etc. The pregnancy, she gave birth to a son, the son fell ill, and eventually the son dies. Now, everyone in the palace knew what went down. They probably did not know about the secret letter that went out to Joab, but they definitely knew about the midnight sheet shenanigans and the subsequent pregnancy. That was hot gossip in the palace. So the shame of this scandal was more than enough to have her disqualified. Bathsheba disqualified. But then later we read this verse. This is 2 Samuel 12, verse 24. Then David, this is after the death of the son, then David comforted his wife, now his wife, Bathsheba, and he went and lay with her, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. And the Lord loved him. Bathsheba became David's wife, became the mother of Solomon. You see, God can write redemption over the pages that you wish to erase. Sometimes we don't only have lines that we want to erase. Sometimes it's pages. Sometimes it's chapters that we wish we never lived. But God can write redemption over those lines, those pages, and those chapters. So arise, because even your worst chapters can be redeemed. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba. 4 women, 4 stories, all different, but they have one thing in common. They were disqualified. They were not supposed to be there. They were not supposed to be included, but they also have this one thing in common, that God chose to include them. God qualified them, or God requalified them. You see, and this is the absolute clincher for this morning, is God does not build his kingdom with the qualified. He calls the disqualified, and he tells them to arise. God does not simply wait for the perfect. He doesn't look for the perfect. He doesn't build his kingdom with the qualified. He approaches the disqualified, and he encourages them, and he lifts them up, and he tells them to arise. And sometimes we may feel disqualified because of our past. Sometimes we feel disqualified because of what we lack. I'm not strong enough. I'm not gifted enough. I'm not big enough. Another rugby story. A guy named Cheslin Colby spent his entire life being told that he was too small for top level rugby. He's too short, he's too light, he's not the right build for an international winger. By all standards of rugby, he was disqualified. He was told to go and try out sevens. Maybe you're quite quick on your feet, you're light on your feet. Maybe sevens rugby is where you should go. And then, if we can have that video clip, and then came this moment in the 2019 Rugby World Cup final against England. Now, that moment should not have happened, but it did. And we all loved it, and we still do. Maybe not Stewie, I'm not sure. By every standard, Cheslin Colby was outmatched. He went around Owen Farrell there, by the way. One of the most effective, although one of the most dirtiest tacklers in world rugby. Just putting that out there. He, if anyone should be disqualified, he should be red carded from rugby for the rest of his life. Anyway, let's keep it clean. You see, what others saw as a limitation, as a disqualification. In fact, under a different rugby coach, Cheslin would never have made it into the Bok team. We've had coaches obsessed with size. Cheslin, under somebody else, would not have played in that game. This is exactly what happened in Matthew chapter 1. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba. They should not have been there. They were disqualified. But God made a way.
Yes. Sorry. Just in worship, I was reminded of a picture that I've seen where school children stand in a line and all of them are competing to build with blocks. And all of the children have got these high towers of blocks, and they're feeling very proud of themselves that they've now been able to build these high towers. And then there's one child that has built this incredible city, very intricate and beautiful, and he's feeling so insecure because he didn't build this high tower. And the whole idea behind it is that obviously when you are creative and you do things that's different from others, everybody is measured in the same way, but that person has got such beauty and such talent. And I was just thinking that there might be someone here in that line that you think you are disqualified because of comparing yourselves to others and their abilities, but that your ability is so unique and beautiful, and that God sees you differently.
So some this morning may feel like Siya Kolisi, that you're from the wrong background, from Zwede. Some might feel that something like Chess and Colby. I just don't have what it takes. I just don't have the size, the bulk, the whatever. Some may feel like one of these four ladies, that my past disqualifies me. You know what? The fact is, outside of God, we are all disqualified. Each and every one of us. We do not qualify. We should not be there. We should not be here. We should not be included in the kingdom. But God. See, because of God, you are not disqualified. Not by your past, not by your background, not by your limitations. Because God is still writing His story. So arise. There needs to be a response. Maybe it would be a good idea to just arise. If you want to, you can stand. It would be great. So, if you've been feeling disqualified or overlooked or unworthy, I want to ask you to respond, not to me, but to respond to God. To simply say, Lord, I will arise. Because the same God who wrote these very unlikely names into the genealogy of Jesus is still writing unlikely people like you and me into His story. Thank you, Lord. We will arise.
While we were worshiping, I also had an impression of some people that might have been mocked at school, bullying, or also feeling that they weren't worth anything. And the scripture came to mind, Romans 8:17. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs. Heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, and indeed we share in His sufferings in order that we may share in His glory. And as that came into my mind, I just saw this kingdom with this king, and you are a prince. No matter what anybody else says, you are a co-prince, you are in a kingdom, you're in a palace.
Would like to invite anyone that feels that impression actually speaks to them to come forward and get some prayer. Okay, we've got coffee and tea in Thrive, and Lingo at the back. You can get any snacks.